Welcome to a gripping and emotionally charged tale that will have you questioning everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and betrayal. In the picturesque yet drama-filled setting of a small coastal town, Ryan and Melissa's seemingly solid marriage begins to crack under the weight of secrets, distance, and unmet needs. But things take a shocking turn when Ryan forms an emotional bond with Amber, a lonely single mother caught between guilt and longing. As boundaries blur and tensions rise, the tangled web of infidelity and unspoken desires spirals out of control, threatening to destroy everything these three lives have built. What happens when loyalty is tested, relationships fracture, and the past refuses to stay buried? Get ready for an unforgettable journey through love, lies, redemption, and the messy, complicated choices that define us. Buckle up, because this is a story filled with twists, heartbreak, and the raw reality of human emotion. Stay tuned, you don't want to miss this. The year was 2016, and the small coastal town of Bayhaven, nestled along the rugged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest, was as serene as ever. The ocean waves crashed against the rocks in a rhythmic lullaby, while the salty breeze carried whispers of stories yet to be told. On the surface, this picturesque town seemed untouched by chaos or scandal. But as anyone who's ever lived in a small town knows, appearances can be deceiving. Our story begins with Ryan Miller, a 34-year-old contractor who'd lived in Bayhaven his entire life. Ryan was the kind of guy who could fix just about anything: creaky floorboards, leaky faucets, and even the occasional broken heart. With his warm smile and steady hands, Ryan had built a reputation as the dependable guy next door. But behind that easy charm was a man who'd become stuck in his own life, weighed down by responsibilities and the silent ache of unfulfilled dreams. Ryan's wife, Melissa, was the complete opposite: vibrant, ambitious, and always chasing the next big thing. She was a freelance journalist who often worked late nights in their cluttered home office, her desk piled high with notebooks and coffee mugs. To anyone looking in, they were the perfect couple. High school sweethearts who'd built a life together, but cracks were forming in the foundation of their marriage, ones that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Then there was Amber Carlson, a 29-year-old single mother who'd recently moved to Bayhaven. She rented a small, weathered house just a few blocks from Ryan and Melissa's. Amber was striking, not in an over-the-top kind of way, but in a way that made people look twice. Her fiery red hair framed her delicate features, and her green eyes sparkled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. Amber had come to Bayhaven for a fresh start, hoping to leave behind the messy divorce and whispers of her ex-husband's infidelities. Now, you might be wondering, what could possibly go wrong in a town so idyllic? Well, buckle up, because this story's about to take a turn. It started on a quiet Wednesday morning. Ryan was in his workshop, sanding down an old oak table he'd promised to restore for a client. The radio hummed in the background, and the smell of sawdust filled the air. Just as he was about to take a sip of his coffee, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Melissa. "Can you pick up some milk on your way back from work? Also, I'll be late tonight. Deadline stuff." Ryan sighed, typing back a quick, "Got it." Lately, Melissa's late nights had become the norm, and he couldn't help but feel like a ghost in his own marriage. He pushed the thought aside and got back to work. Later that day, as Ryan loaded tools into his truck, he noticed Amber standing at the edge of her yard. She was struggling to untangle the garden hose, her brow furrowed in frustration. "Need a hand?" Ryan called out, wiping his hands on his jeans. Amber looked up, startled at first, but then smiled. "I could definitely use one. This thing has a mind of its own." Ryan walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. Within minutes, he'd unraveled the hose and even managed to fix the leaky nozzle that had been giving her trouble. Amber laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're like a superhero. I should probably pay you in cookies or something." Ryan chuckled. Cookies are always a fair trade. That was the beginning, just a simple act of neighborly kindness. But as the weeks went on, Ryan found himself looking forward to those brief encounters with Amber. She had a way of making him feel seen in a way Melissa hadn't in years. Meanwhile, Melissa was buried in her work, chasing a lead on a high-profile story. Her editor had assigned her a deep-dive piece on corporate corruption, and she was determined to make it her magnum opus. She spent hours poring over documents and emails, her mind consumed by deadlines and exposés. In her drive for professional success, she didn't notice the growing distance between her and Ryan, or maybe she just didn't want to. One evening, as Melissa worked late again, Ryan decided to go for a walk. The air was cool, and the moon hung low in the sky. He wandered aimlessly until he found himself passing Amber's house. Her porch light was on, and through the window, he could see her sitting at the dining table, helping her 8-year-old son Ethan with homework. The sight stopped him in his tracks. There was something comforting about the scene, something that reminded him of what he used to have. Amber must have felt his gaze because she looked up and smiled, motioning for him to come in. "I was just about to put on some tea," she said as she opened the door. "Care to join?" Ryan hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like a blanket. Ethan greeted him with a shy wave before scurrying off to his room, leaving the adults to talk. They sat at the table, mugs in hand, as Amber shared bits of her life. How she'd left the city to give Ethan a better life, how she was trying to rebuild after her divorce. Ryan listened intently, his own frustrations bubbling to the surface. He found himself opening up about Melissa, about how they'd grown apart, about how he felt more like her roommate than her husband. "I don't know when it happened," he admitted, staring into his tea. "It's like one day we were happy, and the next, we weren't." Amber reached out, placing a hand on his. "That sounds incredibly lonely." "It is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, charged with unspoken feelings that neither of them dared to name. Over the next few weeks, Ryan and Amber's paths continued to cross, sometimes by chance, sometimes not. He helped her fix a broken cabinet. She brought over muffins as a thank you. Their conversations grew deeper, their connection undeniable. Ryan knew he was treading dangerous territory, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. One evening, after another late-night chat with Amber, Ryan returned home to find Melissa asleep on the couch, her laptop still open on the coffee table. He stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked so peaceful, so different from the woman who seemed perpetually stressed and distant. He covered her with a blanket and turned off the laptop, but as he walked away, the guilt gnawed at him. What was he doing? Where was this road leading? As we reach the close of this first chapter, the stage is set. Ryan, torn between loyalty and longing, finds himself at a crossroads. Melissa, oblivious to the growing storm, is consumed by her own ambitions, and Amber, caught in her own web of heartbreak, becomes the catalyst for a chain of events that will shake all their lives to the core. But this is just the beginning. What happens next? Stay tuned, because this story is about to heat up in ways you won't expect. The days in Bayhaven were growing shorter, the crisp autumn air hinting at the inevitable arrival of winter. Despite the town's tranquil appearance, tension simmered just beneath the surface, much like the relationships at the center of this story. Ryan, Melissa, and Amber were all wrestling with truths they couldn't quite face, and as they continued to navigate their lives, the cracks between them only deepened. It all came to a head one Thursday evening. Ryan had finished his work early, an unusual occurrence, and decided to spend the evening at home. He'd been avoiding Amber lately, sensing that their growing connection was a line he shouldn't cross, but even as he tried to refocus on Melissa and their marriage, he couldn't help but feel the pull of what might have been. Melissa, true to form, was working late again. The sound of her keyboard clacking filled the house, and Ryan watched her from the kitchen as he chopped vegetables for dinner. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't even notice him watching. "Melissa," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. She looked up, startled. "What's up? Do you want to take a break? I was thinking we could eat together, maybe catch up." Melissa hesitated, her gaze flicking back to the laptop. "I can't, Ryan. This deadline is killing me." "Rain check?" Ryan's shoulders sagged. Yeah, sure. He turned back to the cutting board, but the weight of her dismissal hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about dinner. It was about all the little moments they'd missed. The growing distance that neither of them seemed willing to confront. Meanwhile, Amber was having a night of her own. Ethan had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at school, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened street. She hadn't seen Ryan in days, and though she told herself it was for the best, the ache of his absence was undeniable. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Ryan's name. Hey, you okay? The message read. Amber hesitated before typing back. I'm fine. You? There was a pause before his reply came through. Just needed someone to talk to. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her thoughts swirling. She knew she should tell him to talk to Melissa, that it wasn't her place to be his confidant, but instead, she found herself typing, Want to come over? When Ryan arrived at Amber's house, he told himself it was just a friendly visit, that he needed someone to listen. But as he stood on her porch, the soft glow of the porch light illuminating her face, he felt a rush of emotions he couldn't quite name. Amber smiled, though there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. Come in. They sat on the couch, mugs of tea between them, and talked about everything and nothing. Ryan shared his frustrations about Melissa's constant work, his feelings of being unseen and unheard. Amber listened, her gaze steady and empathetic. You deserve more than that, she said softly. You deserve to feel like a priority. Ryan's chest tightened. Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth trying anymore. Melissa's so focused on her career, and I don't know if there's room for me in her life. Amber reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. You're a good man, Ryan. Don't forget that. The moment stretched between them, the air charged with unspoken feelings. Ryan knew he should pull away, leave before he crossed a line he couldn't uncross, but he didn't move. While Ryan and Amber were having their late-night conversation, Melissa was sitting in her office, staring at a half-finished article. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as exhaustion settled over her. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up to see a message from her editor. Great work on the last piece, keep it up. Melissa sighed, a pang of guilt tugging at her. She knew she'd been neglecting Ryan, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Work was her safe space, the one area of her life where she felt in control. But as she sat there, the quiet of the house pressing in on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. She glanced at her phone again, debating whether to text Ryan. Before she could decide, a new message popped up, from a number she didn't recognize. You don't know me, but I think we need to talk about your husband. Melissa's heart stopped. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who would send a message like that, and what did they mean? The next morning, Melissa woke up to an empty bed. Ryan had already left for work, and she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her after reading that message. She debated whether to bring it up with him, but decided to wait until she had more information. She spent the day digging, trying to track down the sender's identity, but whoever it was had covered their tracks well. By evening, Melissa was no closer to finding answers, but the seeds of doubt had already taken root. When Ryan came home that night, she watched him closely, searching for any signs that he was hiding something. But Ryan, oblivious to her suspicions, greeted her with the same tired smile he always did. Meanwhile, Amber was grappling with her own doubts. Her late-night conversation with Ryan had left her feeling both exhilarated and guilty. She didn't want to be the reason his marriage fell apart, but she also couldn't deny the connection they shared. That weekend, as she sat in her living room, Ethan playing with his Legos on the floor, she decided to call her sister, Claire. Claire was her rock, the one person she could always count on to give her honest advice. Amber, Claire said, as soon as she picked up. What's going on? You sound stressed. Amber hesitated before spilling everything. About Ryan, about the feelings she couldn't ignore, about the late-night conversations and stolen moments. Amber, Claire said firmly. You need to be careful he's married. Even if things aren't perfect between them, it's not your place to get involved. I know, Amber whispered. But it's not that simple. He's not happy and I don't know. I just feel like we understand each other in a way no one else does. Claire sighed. I get it. But think about Ethan. Think about what kind of example you're setting for him. Do you really want to be the other woman? Amber's stomach churned. No, of course not. Then you need to figure out what you really want, Amber, before this goes any further. As the weeks passed, the tension between Ryan, Melissa, and Amber continued to build. Melissa couldn't shake her suspicions, especially after finding a receipt for 2 cups of coffee in Ryan's truck. Amber, torn between her feelings for Ryan and her desire to do the right thing, began pulling back. And Ryan, caught in the middle, found himself questioning everything: his marriage, his loyalty, and his own heart. The cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. If you're still with me, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next in this explosive story. Things are heating up, and trust me, you won't want to miss the twists and turns coming your way. Leave a comment below and let me know where you think this story is headed. The storm brewing between Ryan, Melissa, and Amber was about to reach its breaking point. Weeks of subtle glances, hushed conversations, and unspoken truths had set the stage for the inevitable explosion in Bay Haven, where secrets couldn't stay buried for long. The cracks in their fragile lives were widening by the minute. It all started on a chilly Friday evening. The town was alive with the buzz of a fall festival, families gathering on the town square to enjoy carnival rides, hot cider, and pumpkin carving. Melissa had insisted on attending despite her busy schedule, hoping it would be a chance to reconnect with Ryan. He, on the other hand, had reluctantly agreed, his mind drifting back to his last conversation with Amber. Amber had been pulling away, and Ryan could feel it. Her texts were shorter, their encounters fewer. He told himself it was for the best, that he needed to focus on his marriage. But as he walked hand in hand with Melissa through the festival, the weight of his conflicted emotions pressed heavily on his chest. The festival was packed with familiar faces, but Ryan's attention was immediately drawn to Amber, who stood near a booth with Ethan. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment, Ryan considered turning around, but before he could, Melissa followed his gaze. "Who's that?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with curiosity. Ryan hesitated, knowing the truth could spark something he wasn't ready to face. "That's Amber. She moved here recently. I fixed a few things at her house." Melissa raised an eyebrow, her journalist instincts kicking in. "She seems nice." Ryan forced a smile. "Yeah, she is." As they walked away, Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, and for the first time, she began to see the cracks she'd ignored for so long. Later that night, while Ryan and Melissa wandered through the crowd, Amber and Ethan ran into Claire. Amber's sister Claire, ever the straight shooter, wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. "Amber," she said, pulling her aside while Ethan played with some other kids. "You have to stop this." "Stop what?" Amber asked, though she already knew where the conversation was headed. "Don't play dumb. I saw the way you looked at him just now." Claire gestured subtly toward Ryan, who was visible through the crowd. "This isn't fair to you, to him, or to anyone else involved." Amber sighed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I know it's messy, okay? But it's not as simple as just walking away." "Actually, it is," Claire replied, her voice firm. "You're better than this, Amber. And you deserve more than being someone's escape." Amber didn't respond. She knew Claire was right, but walking away felt like ripping out a piece of her heart. The festival ended with a fireworks display over the bay, but the real fireworks were yet to come. That night, Melissa decided to do some digging. Something about Ryan's demeanor, the way he spoke about Amber, didn't sit right with her. She waited until he was asleep and quietly retrieved his phone from the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: conversations with co-workers, a group chat with his friends. But then she found it. A series of messages from Amber. They weren't overtly romantic, but there was an undeniable intimacy in their tone. Melissa's heart sank as she read them, her mind racing with questions. Why hadn't Ryan told her about this? Was this why he'd been so distant? The next morning, Melissa confronted Ryan. She stood in the kitchen, holding his phone, her expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Care to explain these?" she asked, her voice trembling as she held up the phone. Ryan froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Melissa, I can explain." "Don't you dare say it's not what it looks like," she interrupted, her voice rising. "Because it looks a hell of a lot like you've been confiding in another woman instead of your wife." Ryan set the mug down, his shoulders slumping. "It's not like that. Amber's just a friend." Melissa let out a bitter laugh. A friend. Since when do friends text each other about how lonely they are in their marriages? Ryan opened his mouth to respond but stopped, the words dying in his throat. He didn't know how to explain what he felt for Amber, because he wasn't even sure he understood it himself. "I knew things were rough between us," Melissa continued, her voice breaking. "But I didn't think you'd turn to someone else." I never," Ryan stammered. But Melissa cut him off. "You didn't physically cheat, is that what you're going to say? Because emotionally, Ryan, you've already crossed the line." Ryan's silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, Amber was dealing with her own fallout. Claire's words had hit her hard, and she decided to put some distance between herself and Ryan. She didn't respond to his texts and avoided places she knew he might be, but the more she tried to move on, the more she felt the pull of everything they'd shared. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, Amber found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures of Ethan's birthday, their first weeks in Bayhaven, and, unintentionally, a photo Ryan had taken of her and Ethan laughing over a game night. She stared at it for a long time, the ache in her chest growing. Before she could stop herself, she picked up her phone and typed a message. "We need to talk." Ryan received Amber's message while sitting in his truck, parked outside a job site. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He knew he shouldn't go, not after everything with Melissa, but he also knew he couldn't ignore Amber forever. That evening, they met at the park, a quiet, neutral place where they wouldn't run into anyone they knew. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the water. Amber sat on a bench, her arms wrapped around herself as Ryan approached. "I'm sorry," he said as he sat down beside her. "I know I've made a mess of things." Amber shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're not the only one." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they couldn't say pressing down on them. "I don't want to come between you and Melissa," Amber said finally. "I don't want to be the reason your marriage falls apart." "It's not just about you," Ryan admitted. "Melissa and we've been broken for a long time. I just didn't want to face it." Amber looked at him, her heart aching for the man she'd come to care about so deeply. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I need to figure it out. For Melissa, for Polly, and for myself." Amber nodded, wiping away a tear. "I think we need to stop seeing each other at least until you do." Ryan's chest tightened, but he knew she was right. "I understand." As they said their goodbyes, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving them both in the shadows of their choices. Back at home, Melissa sat in the living room, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel. She hadn't spoken to Ryan since their argument, and the silence between them was deafening. When Ryan finally walked through the door, he stopped, his eyes meeting hers. "We need to talk," he said. Melissa nodded. "Yeah, we do." The tension in the room was palpable as they sat down. And for the first time in years, they laid everything bare. Their frustrations, their regrets, their fears. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but it was real. And as they talked late into the night, both of them realized that the love they once had wasn't gone. It was buried, but it wasn't gone. This is where the stakes are highest, folks. The cracks have turned into full-blown fissures, and our characters are standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the consequences of their choices. What comes next? You'll have to stick around to find out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this roller coaster story. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Are you Team Ryan, Team Melissa, or Team Amber? Let us know. By now, the tension in Bayhaven was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every interaction, every stolen glance, every whispered conversation was charged with emotions that none of our characters could fully articulate. Ryan, Melissa, and Amber were all teetering on the brink of decisions that would change their lives forever. The morning after Ryan and Amber's emotional goodbye, Melissa was up early. She was tired of playing detective, tired of second-guessing everything Ryan said and did. If they were going to salvage anything from the wreckage of their marriage, she needed to confront him head-on. Ryan, bleary-eyed and weighed down by the previous night's events, sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee when Melissa walked in. She didn't waste time with small talk. "I need to know," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Are you in love with her?" Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. "Melissa, don't lie to me," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "I read the messages. I've seen the way you look at her." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Melissa demanded, her voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband has been confiding in another woman instead of me." "I didn't mean for it to happen," Ryan admitted, his voice soft but heavy with guilt. "Amber, she was just someone I could talk to when I felt like I couldn't talk to you." Melissa's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry, but she held it together. "Do you even want to fix this, or are we just going through the motions?" Ryan hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Melissa nodded, her jaw tightening. "At least you're honest about that." Meanwhile, Amber was trying to move on. She threw herself into her work, redecorating her house and spending more time with Ethan. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her own life, Ryan lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake. Claire stopped by one afternoon, bringing coffee and a much-needed dose of tough love. "You look like hell," she said, plopping down on Amber's couch. "Thanks," Amber replied dryly, taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm serious," Claire continued. "You need to stop torturing yourself over this guy. He's married, he's not yours to pine over." Amber sighed, sinking back into the cushions. "I know, I can't help but wonder what if." "What if what?" Claire pressed. "What if he leaves his wife for you? Then what, you're the woman who broke up a family? Is that the legacy you want?" Amber flinched at her sister's words, but they hit their mark. She didn't want to be that person, but letting go of Ryan felt like ripping out a piece of her heart. As the days passed, Melissa began to distance herself emotionally from Ryan. She buried herself in her work, avoiding him as much as possible. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of loss, the realization that the man she'd married might already be gone. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Melissa found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures of their wedding, vacations, and quiet moments at home. The images felt like artifacts from another life, one that she barely recognized anymore. She was still staring at the screen when her phone buzzed. It was a message from her editor. "Great work on the draft. Let's touch base tomorrow." Melissa sighed, setting the phone aside. She'd spent so much time chasing professional success that she hadn't noticed her personal life falling apart. And now she was faced with the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. Was it too late to fix things? Ryan, for his part, was wrestling with his own demons. He'd been avoiding Amber, but that didn't mean she wasn't on his mind. Every time he saw her at the grocery store or in passing on the street, his chest tightened with a mix of longing and regret. One afternoon, while working on a renovation project, Ryan's coworker Tom noticed his distracted demeanor. "You've been off your game lately," Tom said, leaning against the wall. "What's going on?" "Just stuff at home," Ryan replied, not meeting his friend's gaze. "Trouble with Melissa?" Tom guessed. Ryan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." Tom studied him for a moment before speaking. "Look, man, I've been there. Marriage is tough, but if you're not all in, it's not fair to either of you." Ryan nodded, his friend's words hitting uncomfortably close to home. "I know." The turning point came on a rainy Friday evening. Melissa was supposed to be working late, but she came home early, hoping to talk to Ryan. When she walked in the door, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. "Who are you texting?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Ryan looked up, startled. "No one." Melissa crossed her arms. "Don't lie to me." Ryan set the phone down, meeting her gaze. "I wasn't texting her, if that's what you're thinking." Melissa stared at him, the weight of their unspoken issues pressing down on them. "Ryan?" she said, her voice softening. "Do you even want to try anymore, or are we just fooling ourselves?" Ryan hesitated, his heart pounding. He didn't have an answer, and that terrified him. As the rain poured outside, Amber was sitting on her couch, staring at the message she'd typed out but hadn't sent. "I miss you." Her finger hovered over the send button, but something stopped her. She thought about Ethan, about everything Claire had said, and deleted the message. For the first time, Amber realized that letting go wasn't just about Ryan, it was about choosing herself. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing in the hearts of Ryan, Melissa, and Amber. Each of them stood at a crossroads, their choices about to collide in ways none of them could have predicted. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The tension is at an all-time high, and the next chapter promises to bring all the answers, and maybe a few surprises. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Are you rooting for Ryan and Melissa to work things out, or do you think Amber deserves a chance at happiness? Let me know. By now, the lives of Ryan, Melissa, and Amber were spinning out of control, their choices and unresolved emotions hurtling them toward an unavoidable reckoning. Every interaction was fraught with tension, every decision laced with consequences they couldn't foresee. Bayhaven, once a sleepy coastal town, now felt like the stage for an explosive drama about to reach its boiling point. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the weight of the storm. Ryan sat alone in his truck, parked along the quiet stretch of road that overlooked the bay. The sea stretched out in front of him, vast and unrelenting, a mirror of his own turmoil. His phone sat in the cup holder, Amber's contact still open on the screen. He'd resisted the urge to call her, knowing that any contact would only complicate things further. But the ache in his chest didn't care about logic or consequences. At home, Melissa was doing her own soul-searching. After their confrontation, Ryan had left, needing space to clear his head. She'd spent the evening alone, staring at the framed photos on the mantel, reminders of a life that felt like a distant memory. She picked up one of the photos, their wedding day, and traced her finger over Ryan's face. "Where did we go wrong?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Amber was in her living room, folding laundry and trying to keep herself busy. Ethan was asleep upstairs, and the house was eerily quiet. Claire had called earlier, urging her to stay strong, to focus on her son and her future. But Amber's thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan, to the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd listened. She told herself it was over, that they'd made the right decision, but letting go was easier said than done. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and her heart skipped a beat. She reached for it, half hoping it was Ryan, but the message was from Claire. "Thinking of you, stay strong." Amber smiled faintly, grateful for her sister's support, even as her resolve wavered. The next day, Melissa decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed clarity, answers, something to make sense of the chaos in her life. She waited until Ryan left for work before driving to Amber's house. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Amber held the key to understanding what had gone wrong in her marriage. Amber was startled to see Melissa standing on her porch, her expression guarded but composed. "Melissa," she said, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Melissa said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Can I come in?" Amber hesitated before stepping aside. "Sure." They sat in the living room, the tension between them thick and palpable. Melissa wasted no time getting to the point. "I know about you and Ryan." Amber's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what he told you, but—" "He didn't have to tell me," Melissa interrupted. "I've seen the messages." Amber looked away, guilt and shame washing over her. "I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt you." Melissa nodded slowly, her emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. "Did anything happen between you two?" "No," Amber said quickly, her voice steady. "We talked. That's all. But I know it was wrong. I never should have let it go that far." Melissa studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Why did you do it?" Amber hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because he was lonely, and so was I. We connected in a way that felt easy. But I know it doesn't excuse anything." Melissa's jaw tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Do you love him?" Amber's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "It doesn't matter, he loves you. He just doesn't know how to show it right now." Melissa's resolve faltered, and for a moment, she saw Amber not as the enemy, but as another woman caught in the same storm of heartbreak and longing. "Thank you for being honest," Melissa said finally, her voice softening. Amber nodded, wiping her eyes. "I really am sorry." When Melissa returned home, she found Ryan sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression wary. "I went to see her," Melissa said, sitting down beside him. Ryan's eyes widened in surprise. "You did?" "She told me everything," Melissa continued. "And for what it's worth, I believe her when she says nothing happened." Ryan looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, Melissa. For all of it, I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," she said, her voice quiet. "But that doesn't make it any easier." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. Finally, Melissa spoke again. "Do you want to save this? Or are we just dragging it out because we're scared to let go?" Ryan hesitated, his heart pounding. "I want to try," he said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know if I can be the man you deserve." Melissa reached for his hand, her touch tentative but sincere. "Then let's figure it out together." Meanwhile, Amber was having a reckoning of her own. That evening, after putting Ethan to bed, she sat down at her kitchen table with a notebook and pen. She started writing a letter, not to Ryan, but to herself. It was a way of processing everything she'd been through, of finding closure. "Dear Amber," she wrote, "you deserve love, but not like this, not from a man who belongs to someone else. It's time to let go, not just of Ryan, but of the part of you that thinks you're not enough on your own." The tears came then, hot and relentless, but they were cleansing. For the first time in months, Amber felt a glimmer of hope. The stage was set for the climax Ryan and Melissa were tentatively rebuilding. Amber was finding her own path, and Bayhaven was bracing for the fallout of their choices. But the journey wasn't over yet, and the hardest decisions were still to come, and that's where we'll leave it for now. The tension is at its peak, and the next chapter promises answers, resolutions, and maybe even redemption. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this emotional roller coaster. Leave a comment below. Who do you think deserves a second chance, Ryan, Melissa? Or is Amber the one who needs a fresh start? Let me know. The undercurrents of tension in Bayhaven had reached a boiling point, and there was no turning back. Ryan, Melissa, and Amber had all reached critical moments in their lives, where every choice and every conversation could either mend the fractures or shatter everything they'd ever known. The stage was set, and the drama was about to explode in ways no one could predict. Ryan sat at the edge of the dock, the cool night air brushing against his skin as he stared out at the dark water. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on his shoulders. The words he and Melissa had exchanged echoed in his mind. Her quiet strength, her vulnerability, her unwavering demand for answers. For the first time in years, Ryan realized how much he'd underestimated her. Yet, there was another voice in his head, softer but no less persistent Amber's voice, reminding him of the connection they'd shared. Was it really just a fleeting mistake? Or was it something deeper? A chance at the kind of love he no longer believed he could find in his marriage? The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. Ryan turned to see Melissa, her silhouette illuminated by the dim light from the nearby street lamp. She looked hesitant, but determined, her arms wrapped around herself, as if bracing for the conversation to come. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her voice soft. Ryan managed a weak smile. "Couldn't sleep." Melissa walked closer, sitting down beside him for a moment. Neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the gentle lapping of the water. "I've been thinking," Melissa began, her voice trembling slightly, "about us, about everything that's happened." Ryan's heart pounded. He didn't know what she was about to say, but he braced himself for the worst. "I realize something," she continued, her gaze fixed on the water. "We've both been guilty of looking for answers outside of this marriage. I buried myself in work, because it was easier than facing the fact that we were falling apart. And you? You found someone else to confide in." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Melissa held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish. What I'm trying to say is, I want to fight for us, Ryan, but I can't do it alone. I need to know if you're willing to fight too." Ryan stared at her, his chest tightening. The woman sitting beside him wasn't the distant, distracted partner he'd grown used to. She was the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Strong, compassionate, and unafraid to face the hard truths. "I want to try," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I have all the answers, but I want to try." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. That's all I needed to hear. Across town, Amber was having a reckoning of her own. After her conversation with Melissa, she'd spent the night reflecting on her choices. She'd written and rewritten messages to Ryan, only to delete them each time. Deep down, she knew it was time to let go, for real this time. The next morning, Amber made a decision. She called her sister Claire and asked her to come over. "I need your help," Amber said when Claire arrived, her tone resolute. Claire raised an eyebrow. "With what?" "Moving forward," Amber replied. "I've been stuck in this cycle of what-ifs and could-have-beens, and it's time to break free." Claire smiled, her relief evident. "About time. What's the plan?" Amber took a deep breath. "I'm going to focus on Ethan, on rebuilding my life here, and I'm going to stay away from Ryan. No more messages, no more chance meetings. It's time to put this behind me." Claire hugged her sister tightly. "I'm proud of you, Amber. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Amber nodded, a sense of clarity settling over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Despite their newfound resolve, Ryan and Melissa still had a long road ahead of them, and there was one more hurdle they couldn't avoid: a final conversation with Amber. It wasn't just about closure. It was about ensuring that everyone could move forward without lingering doubts or unresolved feelings. The three of them agreed to meet at the park, a neutral ground where they could talk openly. The air was tense as they sat down at a secluded bench, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging over them. "I want to start," Melissa said, her tone firm but calm. She turned to Amber, her gaze steady. "I want to thank you for being honest with me, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened." Amber nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and guilt. "Thank you, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry for any pain I caused." Melissa's lips curved into a faint smile. "I appreciate that." Ryan cleared his throat, his nerves evident. "I owe you both an apology to Melissa. for letting things get to this point, and to Amber, for dragging you into something I had no right to involve you in." Amber looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "We all made mistakes, Ryan. The important thing is what we do next." Melissa nodded, reaching for Ryan's hand. "And what we do next is move forward together." Amber smiled faintly. "And I'll be moving forward too. I wish you both the best." The conversation ended on a bittersweet note, but it was exactly what they all needed, a chance to close one chapter and begin another. In the weeks that followed, Ryan and Melissa worked hard to rebuild their marriage. They attended counseling sessions, spent more time together, and made a conscious effort to communicate. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt and frustration, but for the first time in years, they were truly trying. Amber, meanwhile, threw herself into her new life. She joined a local book club, started taking yoga classes, and even began dating again, tentatively, but with an open heart. Her bond with Ethan grew stronger as she focused on being the best mother she could be. The storm had passed, but the lessons it left behind were indelible. Ryan, Melissa, and Amber had all been forced to confront their own flaws and vulnerabilities, and in doing so, they discovered a resilience they never knew they had. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The story has reached its turning point, and the final resolution is just around the corner. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this emotional journey. Let us know in the comments, do you think Ryan and Melissa will make it, or is Amber destined for a fresh start? Your thoughts matter. The emotional turmoil that had gripped Ryan, Melissa, and Amber seemed to be easing, but the storm was far from over. Even as they each tried to move forward, the unresolved feelings and decisions left lingering in the air threatened to upend their delicate progress. It was only a matter of time before their paths collided again, leading to revelations that none of them could have anticipated. Melissa had always prided herself on her ability to adapt and thrive under pressure. Whether it was at work or in her personal life, she tackled challenges head-on. But now, as she stood in front of her therapist during a solo session, she was beginning to realize that her strength had also been her biggest flaw. "I thought focusing on work was the right thing to do," Melissa admitted, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I thought I was providing stability for Ryan, for us, but the truth is, I used it as an escape." Her therapist nodded, letting the silence stretch between them before speaking. "What are you escaping from, Melissa?" Melissa's throat tightened as she considered the question. "The fear that I wasn't enough, that if I gave all of myself to Ryan and it still didn't work, I'd have nothing left." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time, Melissa saw her own role in the breakdown of their marriage, and while it didn't excuse Ryan's actions, it gave her the clarity she needed to start healing. Across town, Ryan was sitting on the floor of his workshop, surrounded by scraps of wood and unfinished projects. The space that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on him as he replayed the events of the past few months. He picked up a photograph from his workbench, a picture of him and Melissa on their first anniversary. They were standing on the beach, arms around each other, their faces lit with unrestrained joy. Looking at it now, Ryan barely recognized the man in the photo. "What happened to us?" he whispered to no one in particular. As he stared at the picture, a memory surfaced, Melissa surprising him with a homemade dinner after a long day, the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the way her hand fit perfectly in his. He realized, with startling clarity, that he'd stopped noticing those moments long before Amber entered the picture. "I let myself stop trying," Ryan murmured, his voice breaking, "and that's on me." It was a sobering realization, but it also sparked something in him, a determination to make things right, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. For Amber, moving on meant starting over. She'd thrown herself into her work and even signed up for a pottery class at the local community center. It was during one of these classes that she met Michael, a kind and easygoing man with an infectious smile. He was a widower raising 2 kids on his own, and they bonded over their shared experiences of rebuilding their lives. "You've got a real talent," Michael said one evening, gesturing to the clay vase Amber had just finished shaping. Amber laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thanks, but I think you're being generous." "No, I mean it," Michael insisted. "You're good at taking something messy and turning it into something beautiful." Amber paused, his words hitting closer to home than he probably realized. She smiled at him, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As autumn gave way to winter, Bayhaven's annual holiday festival brought the town together once again. It was a chance for residents to celebrate, reconnect, and leave their troubles behind, if only for a night. But for Ryan, Melissa, and Amber, the festival became the backdrop for a series of events that would change everything. Melissa had convinced Ryan to attend, hoping it would be a step toward rebuilding their relationship. They strolled through the twinkling lights and festive decorations, trying to recapture some semblance of normalcy, but the unspoken tension between them lingered, a reminder of how far they still had to go. As they approached the town square, Ryan froze. Standing near the carousel was Amber, her son Ethan, laughing as he tried to win a stuffed animal at one of the game booths. She hadn't seen them yet, and Ryan felt a pang of guilt for the emotions that stirred within him. Melissa followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You should go say hello," she said quietly. Ryan turned to her, startled. "Are you sure?" Melissa nodded, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. "It's fine, Ryan. We're all trying to move forward, right?" Ryan hesitated before making his way over to Amber. She looked up as he approached, her face a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice tentative. "I didn't expect to see you here." Amber smiled faintly. "Same, how are you?" "I'm working on things," Ryan replied, glancing back at Melissa, who was watching them from a distance. "Melissa and I are trying to figure things out." "That's good," Amber said, her tone sincere. "I'm glad." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of everything they'd shared hanging between them, but then Ethan ran up, holding a plush bear triumphantly. "Look what I got, Mom," he exclaimed, beaming. Amber laughed, ruffling his hair. "That's great, buddy." Ryan smiled at the sight, the warmth of the moment cutting through the tension. "He's a good kid." "He is," Amber agreed, her gaze softening. "And he's the reason I have to get this right." Ryan nodded, understanding her unspoken meaning. "Take care of yourself, Amber." "You too," she said, her voice steady. As Ryan walked back to Melissa, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Amber was moving forward, and now it was his turn. That night, as Ryan and Melissa walked home from the festival, the silence between them was different, no longer heavy with doubt, but filled with possibility. "Thank you," Ryan said suddenly. Melissa looked at him, puzzled. "For what?" "For believing in us," Ryan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when I didn't." Melissa smiled, her hand slipping into his. "I think we're finally starting to figure it out." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the holiday lights casting a warm glow on their path. The climax of their story was still ahead, but for the first time, all three of them were on the verge of something they hadn't felt in a long time: peace. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The tension is building toward the ultimate resolution, and the final act promises to deliver answers, growth, and maybe even redemption. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this gripping story. Let us know in the comments, are you rooting for Ryan and Melissa to rebuild their marriage? Or do you think Amber deserves her own happy ending? Your thoughts matter. The emotional storms that had been brewing for months were about to reach their breaking point. Each character stood at a crossroads, with choices that would define not just their futures, but their very sense of self. Ryan, Melissa, and Amber were all pushed to confront the truths they'd been avoiding, their lives teetering on the edge of resolution or disaster. Bayhaven was caught in the grips of an uncharacteristic winter storm. Icy rain lashed against windows, and the wind howled through the narrow streets. The weather seemed almost poetic, a physical manifestation of the internal chaos that each of our characters was facing. Ryan stood by the window in the living room, his arms crossed as he watched the storm rage outside. The flickering light of the fireplace reflected in his eyes, a mix of warmth and the stormy thoughts swirling in his mind. Melissa entered the room, her expression wary. She held 2 mugs of hot chocolate, offering one to Ryan. "Storm's bad tonight," she said, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Yeah," Ryan replied. Taking the mug and sitting down on the couch, Melissa joined him, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the crackling fire filling the void between them. "Ryan," Melissa began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know. Are you all in? Because I can't keep doing this if you're not." Ryan's grip on the mug tightened as he turned to face her. "I've been thinking about that a lot," he admitted. "And the truth is, I don't have all the answers, but I know I want to fight for this. For us." Melissa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. That's all I needed to hear. Across town, Amber was weathering her own storm. The power in her house had gone out, and she and Ethan huddled under blankets in the living room, a battery-powered lantern providing the only light. Ethan, ever the optimist, was excited by the adventure of it all. "This is like camping, right, Mom?" he said, grinning as he held a flashlight under his chin. Amber chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Exactly like camping, but without the bugs." Ethan's laughter faded, and he looked up at her with serious eyes. "Do you miss Dad?" The question caught Amber off guard. She paused, searching for the right words. "I miss the good times," she said carefully. "But I don't miss the way things were at the end." Ethan nodded, seeming to understand in a way that only a child could. "I like it better when it's just us." Amber smiled, pulling him close. "Me too, buddy." As Ethan drifted off to sleep, Amber sat in the quiet, her thoughts drifting to Ryan. She knew it was time to let go for good, not just for her, but for Ethan. They both deserved a future free from the shadows of the past. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Bay Haven coated in a layer of ice and snow. Ryan headed into town to pick up supplies, his truck navigating the treacherous roads with care. As he pulled into the small grocery store parking lot, he spotted Amber, bundled up in a thick coat and scarf, carrying a bag of groceries to her car. For a moment, he hesitated. He'd told himself he wouldn't reach out to her again, that it was time to focus solely on Melissa. But as their eyes met, he realized avoiding her forever wasn't realistic. They lived in the same small town, after all. "Amber," Ryan called out, stepping out of his truck. Amber froze, her expression guarded. "Ryan, I just wanted to say hi," he said awkwardly. "How are you?" Amber's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she offered a small smile. "I'm good, Ethan, and I are doing well." "That's good to hear," Ryan said, genuinely relieved. "I'm glad." There was a pause, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Amber broke the silence. "Melissa's lucky to have you. I hope you two figure things out." Ryan nodded, his chest tightening. "Thanks, Amber. That means a lot." As she got into her car and drove away, Ryan felt a strange sense of closure. He realized that while he'd cared deeply for Amber, it was Melissa he wanted to fight for. Amber had been a lifeline during a dark time, but now it was time to let go. Later that night, Ryan and Melissa sat down for dinner, their conversation tentative but honest. They talked about their hopes, their fears, and the mistakes they'd made. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they were truly seeing each other. "I want us to make new memories," Melissa said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Not just try to fix the old ones." Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Me too." But their moment of connection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Melissa frowned, glancing at Ryan as she stood to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Amber standing on the porch, her expression unreadable. "Amber?" Melissa said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" I I wanted to talk to both of you, Amber said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Ryan joined Melissa at the door, his brows furrowed. Amber, is everything okay? Amber took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between the two of them. I wanted to say thank you for everything, for showing me what I needed to see about myself, and I wanted to apologize one last time for any pain I caused. Melissa's expression softened, and she nodded. Thank you, Amber. That means a lot. Amber smiled faintly. I'm moving on. I just thought you should know. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ryan and Melissa standing in the doorway. They watched her go, the weight of her words sinking in. She's stronger than I gave her credit for, Melissa said quietly. Ryan nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. She is. The next day, Ryan and Melissa took a walk along the beach, the icy waves crashing against the shore. They talked about their plans for the future, about the ways they could rebuild their lives together. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, they felt like they were on the same team. Amber, meanwhile, packed up the last of her ex-husband's belongings and dropped them off at a donation center. It was a symbolic act, a way of closing the door on the past and stepping into a new chapter. The story was hurtling toward its resolution, and all three characters were finally finding their footing. But there was still one final chapter left, one last moment to tie everything together. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The climax is here, and the resolution is just around the corner. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this emotional journey. Leave a comment below. Are you happy with how the story is unfolding, or do you think there's more to be resolved? Your thoughts matter. The emotional undercurrents swirling around Ryan, Melissa, and Amber were finally coming to a head. Each of them had taken steps toward resolution, but unresolved feelings and hidden truths still loomed over their paths. The story was hurtling toward its climax, with revelations and decisions waiting to reshape everything they knew. Melissa stood in her kitchen early one morning, watching the coffee drip into the pot. Her mind replayed the past few weeks, her conversations with Ryan, and Amber's unexpected visit. She had done everything to stay composed, but the cracks in her resolve were starting to show. Later that day, Melissa met her best friend Kara at a cozy cafe in town. She needed a confidant, someone who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth, but would also remind her of her strength. So, Kara said, stirring her latte, how's everything with Ryan? Melissa sighed, her hands wrapped around her mug. It's better we're talking more being honest, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Kara tilted her head. Do you love him? I do, Melissa admitted. But I'm scared. What if we go through all this and end up back where we started? Kara leaned forward, her expression serious. Relationships aren't about never failing, Melissa. They're about choosing each other, even when it's hard. Do you think Ryan's choosing you now? Melissa hesitated, Kara's words sinking in. I think he is, but I need to know if I can trust that. Meanwhile, Ryan was having a heart-to-heart of his own. He'd gone to see his older brother Mark, who had always been a source of no-nonsense advice. Mark didn't waste time getting to the point. So, what's the plan, little brother? You gonna keep running in circles, or are you actually gonna fix this? I'm trying, Ryan said, frustration seeping into his tone. But I don't know if it's enough. Mark crossed his arms, leaning against his workbench. You screwed up, yeah. But the fact that Melissa's still trying tells me she sees something worth saving. Question is, do you? Ryan stared at the ground, Mark's words hitting him hard. I do. I just don't know if I can give her what she deserves. Mark let out a sharp laugh. Newsflash. None of us are perfect. You just have to show up and keep trying. If you love her, prove it. Amber's decision to let go of Ryan was firm, but that didn't mean it was easy. One evening, she found herself writing a letter she had no intention of sending. It was a way to process everything she felt, to put into words what she couldn't say aloud. Ryan, I'm not writing this to ask for anything. I'm writing because I need to let go of what might have been. You helped me see parts of myself I didn't know were there, good and bad. For that, I'm grateful, but I need to focus on my future, and so do you. I hope you and Melissa find your way back to each other. You both deserve that. Take care, Amber. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, a symbolic act of closure. The next day, Amber threw herself into a new project at work and agreed to go on a second date with Michael, the kind-hearted widower she'd met in her pottery class. It was time to move forward. The holiday festival had been a turning point for all three characters, but the aftermath brought new challenges. Ryan and Melissa were still navigating the delicate process of rebuilding their marriage, and the road ahead was far from smooth. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Ryan reached for Melissa's hand. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe we should get away for a weekend, just the two of us, no distractions." Melissa looked at him, surprised. "You mean like a trip?" "Yeah," Ryan said, his tone hopeful. "We could use the time to reconnect, and it's been years since we've taken a vacation together." Melissa's lips curved into a small smile. "That sounds nice." For the first time in months, Ryan felt a flicker of hope. He knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step in the right direction. The night before their planned weekend getaway, Melissa was tidying up the house when she stumbled upon something unexpected. In the drawer of Ryan's desk, she found a folded piece of paper with her name on it. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words Ryan had written. "Melissa, I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fully repair. I let you down when you needed me most, and for that, I'll always carry regret. But I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us. I love you, even when I don't know how to show it, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you'll let me. Ryan." Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she clutched the letter to her chest. She hadn't expected to find such raw vulnerability from Ryan, and it touched her deeply. When Ryan walked into the room and saw her holding the letter, his face paled. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Melissa shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I'm glad I did." Ryan closed the distance between them, pulling her into his arms. For the first time in years, they felt truly connected, the walls they'd built around themselves finally starting to crumble. While Ryan and Melissa were finding their way back to each other, Amber was closing the door on her chapter with Ryan for good. She visited the beach where they'd once shared a heart-to-heart and let the ocean breeze carry her final thoughts. She pulled out the letter she'd written to Ryan and tore it into small pieces, letting the wind scatter them into the waves. It was a symbolic act, a way of releasing the past and making room for the future. As she turned to leave, Michael appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. Amber smiled, grateful for his quiet support. "Thank you." Together, they walked along the shore, the beginnings of something new unfolding between them. The story was building toward its resolution, but the final moments of tension were still unfolding. Ryan and Melissa's weekend getaway promised to be a turning point, while Amber's new relationship hinted at a fresh start. All three characters had come so far, but their journeys weren't over yet. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The climax is almost here, and the resolution is within reach. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this emotional roller coaster. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Ryan and Melissa can rebuild their love, or is Amber destined for her own happy ending? Your thoughts matter, and here we are. At the end of the journey, Ryan, Melissa, and Amber have all faced their trials, made their choices, and now it's time to see how it all comes together. The tension, the heartbreak, and the revelations have led us to this moment. Let's wrap up this story with a satisfying resolution, one that shows just how far our characters have come. The small cabin nestled in the mountains was perfect, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by nature. It was exactly what Ryan and Melissa needed, a space away from distractions where they could focus on each other. The first night was awkward. They sat by the fire, sipping wine, unsure of how to bridge the gap that still lingered between them. But as the evening wore on, they began to open up. "I was scared," Ryan admitted, staring into the flames. "Scared that I'd already lost you, and instead of fighting for us, I ran." Melissa reached for his hand, her touch gentle. "And I was scared that if I stopped working so hard I'd lose myself. I thought I was protecting us, but I was just pushing you away." They talked late into the night, their words raw and honest. They laughed over old memories, cried over the pain they'd caused each other, and made promises they both intended to keep. By the time the sun rose the next morning, they felt lighter. The wounds weren't fully healed, but they were finally on the same path, walking side by side. Amber stood in her kitchen, packing a lunch for Ethan. It was a simple, mundane task, but it brought her a surprising sense of peace. The chaos of the past few months felt like a distant memory, replaced by a quiet determination to build a better life for herself and her son. Michael stopped by later that afternoon, bringing coffee and a warm smile. "I thought you could use a break," he said, setting the cups on the counter. Amber smiled, grateful for his kindness. "You're too good to me, you know that." Michael shrugged, his grin playful. "Someone has to be." As they sat on the porch, watching Ethan play in the yard, Amber realized something profound. For the first time in years, she felt truly happy. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping happiness of romance novels. It was quiet, steady, and real. And that was enough. Ryan and Melissa returned to Bayhaven with a renewed sense of purpose, but there was still one last piece of unfinished business. Melissa wanted to confront Amber, not with anger or accusations, but with closure. The two women met at a small cafe, the tension between them palpable. Amber was nervous, unsure of what Melissa wanted to say, but she faced her with quiet dignity. "I wanted to thank you," Melissa began, surprising Amber. "For being honest, for stepping back when you could have done the opposite." Amber nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And I want to thank you for giving Ryan another chance. He's lucky to have you." They talked for a while, not as rivals, but as two women who had both faced their own battles and come out stronger. By the end of the conversation, there was a sense of mutual respect between them, a recognition of the strength it took to move forward. As the holidays approached, Ryan and Melissa threw a small gathering for their closest friends and family. The house was filled with laughter, the scent of mulled cider, and the warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth. Polly ran around the living room, giggling as she played with her cousins. Ryan watched her, a smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home. Melissa joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. "We did good, didn't we?" she said, her voice soft. "We did," Ryan agreed, pulling her close. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face, still moments of doubt, but they'd learned how to face them together, and that made all the difference. Amber decided to spend Christmas Eve at the beach, her favorite place to reflect. She brought a small notebook, writing down her hopes and goals for the coming year. It was a tradition she'd started after her divorce, a way of focusing on the future instead of the past. Michael joined her later, bringing hot chocolate and a blanket. They sat together, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, his voice gentle. "About how far I've come," Amber replied, "and how excited I am for what's next." Michael smiled, his hand finding hers. "Me too." Amber looked out at the ocean, a sense of peace washing over her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she was ready to embrace it. The camera pans out, showing the lights of Bayhaven twinkling against the backdrop of the night sky. In one house, Ryan and Melissa are tucking Polly into bed, their laughter echoing softly through the walls. In another, Amber and Michael are toasting to new beginnings, their smiles bright and hopeful. Life in Bayhaven moves on, just as it always does. But for Ryan, Melissa, and Amber, the lessons they've learned and the strength they've gained will guide them as they step into the next chapter of their lives. And that's the story of Ryan, Melissa, and Amber, three people who faced heartbreak, doubt, and tough choices, but ultimately found their way forward. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but that's life, isn't it? It's messy, unpredictable, and full of surprises. But if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that growth is possible, even in the hardest of times. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments, what did you think of the ending? Did it leave you satisfied? Or do you think there's more to the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care and keep watching.